Hello, I am Tom the Tale Teller, and Rugby Art Gallery and Museum have asked me, as part of their virtual festival, to tell you a story, a very special story, the story of rugby. Now, you may have seen me out and about around Rugby. I've told stories at the art gallery, I've told stories at the church, I've told stories down at the old tool shed cafe before they moved to Coventry. I've been around here and there, and I've been plying my trade, for I am a traditional storyteller. I tell stories of long ago, stories of far, far away or just around the corner. I collect myths and legends and folklore, and they all live in my head. I don't read them from books. I don't practice them through scripts. They live in my head and I tell them, and every time I tell them they change. And they change depending on the audience I'm telling them to. But this story is a special story. As I say, Rugby Art Gallery and Museum have asked me to tell you the story of rugby. Now, the Art Gallery and the Museum have a fantastic education programme, which I have been part of. And part of that is a magic carpet session, where younger visitors get to find out the history of their local area. They get to travel through time on a magic carpet, discovering some of the key moments in the past for rugby. That's basically what I'm going to do today. I'm going to take you on a magic journey. Yes, you, and you, and you, and even you, the big one at the back. I'm going to take you all on a journey through time and space, because I don't need a TARDIS like the Doctor. I don't need a special time machine. All I need is the power of my voice and the stories which I carry in my head. I'm going to tell you these stories, and these stories will start to draw the pictures in your minds. And just by closing your eyes and listening, you will be transported back hundreds, thousands of years. And thousands of years ago is where my first story starts. So it was many thousands of years ago. This green and pleasant land, which we call Great Britain, was inhabited by a simple folk. A folk we now know as Celts and Picts. And they lived and farmed and hunted on the land. They lived in small communities, living in round houses dotted here and there. Most of the land was covered in thick forest, oak forest, with pastures and meadows dotted here and there. And life was good. These people, they worshipped the old gods, the gods of the sky, the gods of the land, the gods of the water, like the great giant god Bel, the god of spring and summer, or Danu, the queen of gods, and she was the god of winter and autumn. But then, 2 millennia ago, 2,000 years ago, to this land came a strange man. Upon great ships they came. They came plated in tough, shiny metal, their heads encased in metal, and some of them wore great horses' manes down or across their head. They had sharp, strong swords and even stronger shields, and they marched across the land, and they took what they wanted by force. The Roman Empire had come to Britain. Now, yes, the Celts' way of life was disrupted. They were forced to go from paganism to Christianity. However, it wasn't all bad. With these new visitors came trade. Trade of goods and things from outside this country. And also, there came new stories and new technology. Stories of far away and technology from lands far away. These people, the Romans, they brought change. But what did the Romans do for us? Well, they brought sanitation, flushing toilets. They brought irrigation, a way to water the plants and the crops. They brought roads, something we can still see today. The roads the Romans built were so good, roads have not yet, even to this day, been able to be made that good. You look at the roads out about nowadays, covered in potholes and bumpy. Not Roman roads. No, these roads were straight as the crow flies, and they crisscrossed this land, carrying their armour, their warriors, their food, their supplies and their trade goods to and from the places they valued most. Near the area we now call Rugby, there were two very important roads. One was the old Foss Way, straight road. And the other one was a road we know today as the A5, but back then they called it Watling Street. And Watling Street linked Londinium with North Wales, one of the final frontiers. Scotland and North Wales, one of the final frontiers of the Romans, full of wild barbarian hordes. Or so they would say. And these roads were so important that the traffic was very heavy upon them. None more so than Watling Street. And at a point not far from Rugby itself, where Rugby stands now, there by the side of Watling Street, three rivers intersected. And where the three rivers intersected, there were three bridges. An area known as Three Bridges, or in the Latin which the Romans spoke, tri meaning three, pontium meaning bridge, tripontium. And tripontium, because of the rivers, it had crystal clear waters, and so a spa, as we would call them nowadays, a bath, came about. This great baths sprung up by the side of Watling Street, and many a visitor stopped there. Many an army on the way to war would stop there and rest their weary feet, for they did not ride on horses, they marched. And they would rest there. They would take in the baths and the spa facilities and the hot waters and the massages. And Tripontium began to grow and grow and grow, until the day came when the Roman Empire was fighting battles on many fronts and so withdrew from Britain. And with the leaving of Romans, great buildings such as the baths at Tripontium fell derelict and were lost. Britons went back mostly to the way they used to live. The Britons then started making trade deals of their own. That's when you get into the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons era. And then you get to the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages, the kind of era you would think of when you thought of King Arthur or Robin Hood. Knights, shields and swords and chivalric codes and chivalry. My next story comes from this time. A time after the Romans had left and their presence had drifted off into story and legend. A time when it was said that great creatures still walked this land. Giants, griffins, dragons. But my story concerns the former, a giant. This giant lived somewhere in Shropshire. Nobody quite knows where. But there in Shropshire this giant lived, and the giant had a giant cow. This cow stood the size of a double-decker bus. It was huge. But it wasn't a nasty cow, and the giant wasn't angry or nasty. He was a kindly old soul. And this cow could give milk forever. Infinite amount of milk. You could milk it until the cows came home. See what I did there? But then, one day, there was a local hag, a witch, a user of the old magic. And she decided to not only milk the cow to get her fill her buckets, which was fine. The people were allowed to do this. But she then took a sieve and she began to milk the cow into the sieve. And the cow, it turned her head round and she looked and she saw what this hag was doing. She saw her precious milk, although it was considered infinite. She could see it spilling onto the ground and flowing away into the streams and the rivers, and she became enraged, much the same way as a bull becomes enraged at the sight of red. And it snorted and it stamped. And in the end, it became so enraged, it bucked and it charged. And it set off on a rampage. A rampage a giant could not stop it. A rampage through the country. It went over the hills and down the dales. It flattened villages and towns. And it ran south, down towards Warwickshire. And as it got closer to Warwick, news came to the court, there at the Warwick Castle, of this rampaging cow, this giant of a beast. And so one man stepped forward, Sir Guy of Warwick. He was a strong knight. He was legendary. Many tales are still sung and told about his deeds. He stepped forward and said that he would go and see to this giant cow. And he travelled off in search of the cow, and he followed the trail of mess, destruction and mayhem until he came to an area known as Dunsmore Heath, outside of a small idyllic market town known as Rugby, not far from a place that was once known as Typontium, just off a Roman road, a place now legend and myth to the locals. There upon Dunsmore Heath, a stone's throw from the market town into which the cow was about to run through, Sir Guy drew his sword and held his shield steadfast. And he shouted at the cow, "Cow! Your destruction and terror ends now!" And the cow turned. And the cow, although it was a female cow, not a bull, it still had great horns. Horns as long as an adult's leg. A metre and a half, maybe some would say. And so sharp that it could easily pierce through your body. And it turned, and like a bull would, it lowered its head, and it stamped its hoof, and it charged at Sir Guy. Sir Guy braced himself behind the shield, and his shield and his armour took the brunt of the charge, and it knocked him to the side. He gathered himself once more. He turned round, and the cow charged once more at him, and he managed to slash at its leg as he dived out of the way. The now wounded cow turned and charged for a third time, and this time its leg that had been slashed at the front. It gave way, and it fell to the ground in a heap, and Sir Guy jumped forward and did the deed, and ended the cow's life. To prove his deed, he took a rib bone from the cow back to the court at Warwick, and he was heralded as a hero. And the people of Rugby heralded him as a hero. And it was said for many years that rib bone was still on show at Warwick Castle. Where it is now, though, I do not know. But that area on Dunsmore Heath, and now you know it is Dunchurch and various other places beginning with Dun, and that cow became known as the Dun Cow, and you may have seen the pub called the Dun Cow. And so it was. Time marched on, and that story once more slipped off into the annals of history, and with the smokiness of time it became entwined with myth and legend. Rugby? Well, Rugby thrived. Rugby was a market town next to the A5, near the Fosse Way, these ancient roads that still stood. It was on a river. It had people coming from miles around to sell their wares and to buy things. And it began to grow and grow and grow. And a school emerged. One of the finest schools in all of the land. If you were to be educated at Rugby School, you were known to have the best education. And so it was that a game became very popular with the boys at that school. A game in which you would kick an inflated pig's bladder with your foot. You weren't allowed to touch it with your hands, but you could kick it with your foot, with your knee, or if you dared, your head. A game using your foot and a ball, football. A very popular sport there in Rugby School. But one day, a pupil called William Webb Ellis, decided this game was boring. He was no good at kicking with his feet. He was better with his hands. And so during a game of football, William decided, instead of trying to kick the ball to the goal, he would pick it up and run with it and place it in the goal. But as he did, the other boys, they were furious. "You can't do that! Stop! Come back!" they shouted. And they chased him. And they chased him and they chased him and they started knocking at his heels. And then in the end, one of them jumped, grabbed William round the waist and dragged him to the floor. One of the other boys picked up the ball and ran. William managed to get to his feet. He managed to grab that boy, pulled him to the floor, picked up the ball and ran all the way to the goal and put it on the floor, past the line of the goal, and he exclaimed that he'd won. He'd scored. And he said he had to try very hard to score. And so it was. The boys liked this game so much that they began to develop rules for it. The goals changed. The pitch stayed roughly the same. The amount of players changed. And the game then started to spread to other schools and colleges and universities. It spread among the land and people liked it so much they would ask where it came from and what it was called. The name, well, it didn't have one, but people would say it came from rugby. And so it was. They started to call this sport rugby. And so it was that rugby was invented. Fast forward from the 1800s to the early 1900s. It was a time of turmoil, a time of terror. Britain found itself standing alone. Like William Webb Ellis holding that ball, running against two teams trying to tackle him. Britain found itself headlong against the Nazis. World War II was in full swing, and Britain had developed the most amazing aerial fighting machine ever to be invented, the Spitfire. This Spitfire aircraft was so nimble it could outfly any German plane. And thanks to a father and his 13-year-old daughter, it had not 4, but 8 machine guns. 8 machine guns, 4 on each wing. And with that firepower, it was just enough to outdo all the invading planes the Luftwaffe of the Nazi army could send over. Between that, the Hurricane, and the Lancaster bomber, we began to hold off the Luftwaffe. But in secret, the Nazis were developing a more advanced piece of tech. They realised that the days of the propeller were numbered. They were experimenting with jet engines, rockets. They developed the flying bombs. Basically bombs with a jet on the back and wings that would fly through the air from Germany and land somewhere in England on one of our towns and cities. Now, Britain knew they were developing this, and so it was imperative that they invented the jet engine too. One man worked so hard. He developed the first commercially viable jet engine. A man called Frank Whittle. Living, working round the area of Rugby at Bitterswell Airfield, which is now Magna Park, he managed to develop this jet engine. This jet engine, although the war came to an end before it was commercially put into place and before it was widely used, it did turn the tide. And it went on to be developed for planes of different sizes. So Frank Whittle changed aviation history as we know it. The jet plane was invented. And so it was that Rugby was once more put on the map. And so it is, my story comes to an end. We've gone from Romans through to legends, to the invention of a sport for which rugby is synonymous for, through to the greatest invention, arguably, of the 20th century. All of this in the area we know as rugby. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope you can see that how important it is to know your local area, to know the history, the folklore, the legends, the stories of the area. For it brings us together. It gives us a sense of place. Thank you. Look out for me. I'm on YouTube as Tom the Tale Teller. I'm on Facebook as Tom the Tale Teller. I'm sure when things get back to normal, I'll be back at the museum at some point. I'll be around rugby. I'll be there with my folklore books to sell. I'll be there telling my tales from my story sticks. And I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.